Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about utilitarianism. Let's start with what utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism is a moral theory, it's a normative theory. It has a chief central principle that tells you what you ought to do. Let's say if you found yourself in a moral dilemma. What's the morally correct thing to do? Well, you look at the consequences, you look at the outcome and potential outcomes of your action, and you choose the action that will lead to the best consequences, not just for you, but for everyone affected. And who counts as a one? Just people? No, all sentient beings. A sentient being is a being that can experience pain and pleasure. So we're concerned not just with how our action impacts us as individuals and other human beings, but also other sentient beings. What are some examples of sentient beings? Are cows, pigs, and chickens sentient? Yes. What about our pet dogs and cats? Yes. What about reptiles and amphibians? Probably. What about other mammals? I mentioned some. Yes. What about fish? Probably lots of them. What about insects like mosquitoes and flies? Well, that's an empirical question. And if they can experience pleasure and pain, then they're counted. If not, then we're not concerned with them, at least not as much as we are with sentient beings. Let's look at this central principle of utilitarianism, what we'll call the principle of utility. Historically, when you look at the classic utilitarians like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, they talked about utilitarianism in terms of the greatest happiness principle. The greatest good for the greatest number is often touted as a slogan of utilitarians. So we're going to get a bit more precise. We'll update the principle. And for our purposes, we'll define it as follows. An action is morally correct, it's morally right, if and only if it maximizes the expected utility of all the affected sentient beings taken collectively, taken as a group. Put it this way, whenever you're at a moral decision point, you are going to consider all your options. What are all the things that I can do in this moment? And you are to calculate as best you can the outcomes of all of those actions. And you are to consider the utility, the net utility that will be yielded from all of those actions. How do you figure out the net utility? And what is utility? Well, utility for these philosophers is happiness or pleasure. And we're not just talking about short lived, ephemeral, instant gratification sorts of pleasures. We are including what John Stuart Mill called high pleasures. Hedonistic pleasures, we tend to think of them as pleasures of the flesh. So the sorts of pleasures that you get from satisfying your basic needs. Think about your basic needs. We need food, water, shelter, etc. Think about how good it feels when you meet those needs. When you're cold and you go by a fire. When you're exhausted and you can finally sleep. When you're starving or really thirsty and you get to eat or drink. So those are bodily pleasures. Those are what we might consider animalistic pleasures. In addition to trying to maximize those, we should also maximize what Mill called high pleasures. High pleasures are pleasures not of the flesh, but of the mind. Doing philosophy, not surprisingly, counts as a high pleasure for these thinkers. Compare the enjoyment you get out of doing a crossword puzzle or playing chess or working on a brain teaser or having a stimulating conversation. These things are all enjoyable, but in much more of a mental way. So at that decision point, you factor in all of the pleasure that will be gained from the potential action, but you also must factor in all of the pain and suffering, if any, would occur from you acting or behaving in that way. And then you come to the net. So you do a bit of a calculation. So you weigh the good against the bad, and that comes to some degree of happiness or utility or pleasure. And then you go down the path. Remember, we're at that moral decision point. You take the path that will result in the most net happiness. You perform the action you decide to do, or this is what you should do. Not, we fail sometimes, but what you should do if you're a utilitarian is go down the path where you maximize utility. And you might think, how can I calculate this decision when there might be an infinite amount of paths in front of me? And how am I supposed to exactly figure out how much pain, pleasure, and happiness will result? Well, there's a little bit of a guessing game here. You have to speculate. But the good news is we've evolved to do this, and we do it quite quickly. Think of a simple example. When you go to a restaurant and you look at the menu, the server asks you, what would you like? Out of all the combinations, of which there might be an infinite amount, you can in seconds find the one that will make you the happiest. Now, we're not perfect. Many times the server brings you your food and maybe you're with someone and you look at the dish that they got and you think, I should have ordered the omelet, right? You're looking down at your pancakes if you're at a breakfast place, something like that. That happens. But for the most part, we're pretty good at very quickly figuring out how things are going to play out and how they are going to benefit ourselves. Now, if we were just trying to maximize our own happiness, like if I was just trying to maximize my individual happiness, that wouldn't be so much utilitarianism. That would be something closer to egoism, a theory that I talk about in another video. So utilitarians, it's not just about the I, it's not just about you, it's about everyone, and this includes non-human animals as well. Now, must we say that an animal's happiness is on par with a human being's happiness? Well, you could make up your own form of utilitarianism where every sentient being's happiness needs to be weighted equally. You could do that. That would be, that's one of the fun things about philosophy is you get to tailor it any way you see fit. But most utilitarians will have a rank order of happiness. And this is grounded in perhaps a bit of speciesism, but it's kind of how a lot of us feel in a very deep-seated sense that, if it came down to a building's on fire and there's a human trapped in there and a cat trapped in the building, I know there's a lot of kinds of cat people that might say, well, humans are awful and you should save the cat. And maybe tongue in cheek, we might say this. But most of us would say if it came down to one or the other, it's a hard choice. It's a sad choice. We would end up saving the human being. So that's what a lot of utilitarians will say. Okay, so that's the principle of utility. And what we're going to do today is apply it to thought experiments, a lot of these fun thought experiments that we've already examined in other videos. Before we apply it to some of these cases, let's remind ourselves first about the advantages of utilitarianism. Well, if you are a pro animal rights person, there's room in this theory for you because, as opposed to other moral theories that only take into account, only factor in other human beings, or maybe even in a more limited, narrow sense, only other people, because there might be a distinction between persons and humans, right? If you are a vegetable lying in a hospital bed, we might say it's still a human being in that bed, but they might have lost their personhood. They're no longer there mentally. So some theories really only regard as moral agents human persons. And a lot of people who are pro animal rights, they take issue with that. And they might point to a theory like this to defend their intuitions. So that's one of the advantages of utilitarianism. As we will see in the first thought experiment that we're going to look at, there is very much room for charity and a duty to others, even people that we have no familial or friendship bonds or attachments to. A lot of people like this theory because it seems to tie in nicely with some of our natural inclinations, maybe our human nature, if there is such a thing, human biology, how we evolved, how we're hardwired. And it's pretty straightforward. It's all about happiness. We want to make the world a better place, and we should do that with all of our decisions. So it's common sense, it's simple. And one more thing, it doesn't matter if you are the king, the queen, or if you are a commoner. Doesn't matter if you are the president or someone living on the street. Because you are a sentient human being, your value and your happiness, other things being equal, is weighted the same. So there is a sense of equality that is built into this theory, and that's a nice advantage.